The HOA spent 8 months and over $2 million building 23 luxury cabins on what they thought was community land. They hosted ribbon cuttings, gave TV interviews, and even started renting the cabins out online. And the whole time they were building on my private island, I didn't stop them. Not once. I watched every board go up, every nail hammered in, because I knew something they didn't. When the time came, I was going to walk into that courtroom, pull out the original deed, and take everything back in front of them. Do you want to know how it happened? Let's rewind. It started with the noise. Chainsaws at 6 in the morning, barges moving back and forth across the water, and voices echoing like the whole lake belonged to them. At first I thought maybe the county had a new maintenance project. Then I saw the sign, future site of lakeshore cabins managed by Maple Creek HOA. My stomach dropped. There was only one island on this lake, mine. I rode over the next morning. The men in orange vests looked at me like I was trespassing. One of them, a guy with mirrored sunglasses and a smirk that could curdle milk, waved me off. Sorry, sir, construction area. HOA property. I told him there had to be a mistake. He just shrugged and went back to shouting at his crew. By the third day, they'd cleared a quarter of the trees. My cabin still stood on the far side, hidden behind the ridge, but every thud of falling timber felt like a punch. I called the county records office. They told me they'd received new filings 2 months earlier transferring the parcel to the Maple Creek Homeowners Association. The clerk sounded apologetic but firm. Everything appears legitimate. That was the moment I realized someone had forged paperwork. I'd bought that island 15 years ago, cash, and the deed was locked in a fireproof box under my bed. The HOA must have assumed nobody actually lived there. They filed, built, and bragged about their exclusive lakeside retreat. I wanted to storm over there and shut it down myself. But anger is only useful if you know how to aim it. So I stayed quiet. Let them keep building. Let them pour their money, their hours, and their pride into it. Every nail they drove into the wood was another dollar they'd lose later. By week 5, the cabins started to look almost livable. Shiny decks, glass doors, everything aligned neatly like an architectural magazine spread. I watched from my dock, binoculars in hand, coffee steaming beside me. They had no clue I was watching. The HOA president, a tall woman named Janice who wore designer boots even on dirt, gave interviews about expanding community assets. She called it her vision. I smiled when I heard that, because my real job wasn't just guy with a cabin. I worked for the county inspection office. I was one of the people authorized to verify permits, zoning, and environmental compliance. I'd seen hundreds of illegal builds before, but none so bold, none so personal. Still, I waited. Revenge that comes too early feels like justice on half a tank. I wanted them to feel safe first, confident. I let them get all 23 cabins standing. I let them install docks, advertise online rentals, even throw a small completion barbecue. That night, the sky glowed with their lanterns across the lake, laughter floating over the water. They toasted to profit, to expansion, to themselves. I raised my own glass from my porch, whispering, "Enjoy it while you can." The next morning, I put on my county badge for the first time in months and drove to the inspection office. My supervisor, an old friend named Laura, almost spit out her coffee when she saw the photos I laid on her desk. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is." I nodded. No permits, forged transfer, environmental violations, all of it. She leaned back, smirking. "You want to handle it personally." That afternoon, official inspection notices went out, bright orange papers pinned to every half-built cabin. I made sure to tape the first one right in front of Janice. She came stomping down the path, fury painted on her face. "Who authorized this?" she demanded. I pointed to my badge. "County inspector, ma'am." Her mouth opened, then closed again, like a fish out of water. "You can't just shut down an HOA project," she sputtered. "Sure I can," I said calmly, "especially when it's on my land." Silence that followed was so sharp it almost hummed. Workers froze mid-hammer. A seagull cried somewhere overhead. Janice's eyes flicked toward the cabins, toward the other board members who suddenly found the ground very interesting. "Your land?" she repeated, voice cracking. "Yeah," I said, pulling a folded photocopy of the deed from my jacket pocket. "Bought it in 2009. Paid cash." "You've been building on private property the whole time?" She tried to laugh, to dismiss it as some misunderstanding, but her voice shook. That can't be right. The county, I interrupted, is me. And we're done here until a court sorts this out. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't need to. The quiet confidence did the work for me. By the end of that day, half her crew had packed up, unsure who to believe. The HOA board held an emergency meeting that night, which I listened to from my boat, their voices carrying over the water. They were panicking about permits, about lawsuits, about who had signed what. But the funniest part, they still didn't understand that I was letting them dig their own grave a little deeper. Because while they argued, I was preparing the final blow, the moment when every forged signature, every unauthorized payment, every arrogant assumption would be laid bare in front of a judge. And that was the plan, to let them finish digging before I pulled the deed out in court. They told me I was being dramatic when I started keeping a file. "Old Jack, you worry too much," a neighbor had said once, handing me a bag of feed through a fence. I smiled and kept the receipt. I kept every little scrap that didn't belong in the usual shoebox of memories, emails, a weird invoice that arrived with no return address, a blurry photo someone took from the causeway the night they were hauling in prefab walls. I started cataloging things the way I used to catalog building violations. Date, source, description, why it mattered. It felt ridiculous at first, making a spreadsheet in the evenings while the lake cooled and the sky went purple. But spreadsheets are the quiet, legal equivalent of an arsenal. They don't roar. They win by being boring and precise. Once I had a stack thick enough to make anyone with a law degree blink, I made my first official trip back to the courthouse. I wore jeans and the same old jacket, but I also carried a small cardboard box that contained the evidence I'd gathered. The notarized copy of the deed I kept locked at home, the survey coordinates my friend Earl had dug up from his drawer of retired maps, the time-stamped photos from my little trail camera that had caught the first bulldozer crossing the causeway. I set the box down on the clerk's counter like I'd set an inspection file down 30 years ago, calm, deliberate, full of facts. The clerk looked at me over her glasses and said nothing. She didn't have to. She already knew how these things started. The county took it seriously because of who I used to be, and because the facts were stubborn. Within a week, a formal inquiry had been opened. I didn't shout from the rooftops. I let the notices do their work. Subpoenas served, records demanded, contractors asked to produce permits and soil tests. The very institutions the HOA had tried to outmaneuver, zoning, environmental protection, the state land registry, began to move with the kind of slow, mechanical determination that makes things official. It's not the dramatic stuff people remember. It's the quiet, repetitive grind of procedure that breaks fraud. The HOA board met behind closed doors and tried to respond with PR. They published a glossy statement about community improvement and inclusive planning, complete with smiling stock photos and a list of charitable donations. They hired a local PR firm to soften the edges. They staged a community barbecue and invited the press so people would see laughter and lanterns instead of orange inspector notices. But paperwork doesn't have a smile, and evidence keeps its temper. As the inquiry widened, I started noticing small changes that were delicious in their mundanity. The online rental listings for Maple Creek lakeside cabins disappeared one by one, first the big platforms, then the smaller ones. Reservations that had been made evaporated like dust. Contractors who'd been eager for the next paycheck suddenly had phone calls they needed to return, meetings they had to attend elsewhere. People began to read the fine print. If you told me a year ago that a single line in a registry would cause 30 people to lose their summer bookings, I'd have laughed. The truth is less romantic. People cancel when an orange stop work notice shows up on the door. People panic when a county inspector speaks with a calm voice and a stack of subpoenas. The HOA's strategy drifted toward intimidation. Notices arrived at my door, formal-looking letters from a community compliance officer, threats about fines, warnings about trespass. One of their security guys, a man who looked like he rented his jaw from a boxing gym, stood near my mailbox and tried to look official. He asked me who I thought I was to linger on the shore. He called me names that would have embarrassed a schoolyard. I made a note of him, wrote down the time and the license plate number of his car, and walked back to the house with my camera in my pocket. People think intimidation works because it's loud, but loudness stains. You remember it, But the law remembers ink. I had enough ink. Neighbors began to whisper. Some of them offered sympathetic nods across fences. Others avoided me the way people avoid a weathered storm window, visible, but not to be touched. I got a letter from my daughter one Sunday. "Dad, be careful," she wrote. "Don't let them weigh you down." Her words were soft armor. They made me fold the evidence into a neat packet and breathe. We are taught to protect our kids from storms. We don't always imagine them here, on a quiet lake road. But the truth was, if I backed down now, the storm would come back and keep coming for someone else. If I stood firm, maybe somebody else's grandson wouldn't wake up to a sign that said, "No trespassing." The county started to pull records and things got technical in ways that made my head hum the right way. The plat the HOA had relied on, beautifully printed, stamped, and framed in their clubhouse, turned out to be missing a single but crucial element: the state registration signature that makes a county filing into a binding, statewide record. It was the kind of administrative detail that looks petty until you realize how many institutions hinge on it. Without that signature, the plat looked like a beautifully produced brochure. With it, it might have been law. Without it, the county's registry clerk described it to me as paper theater. Every time the county discovered a new hole in their paperwork, I felt a small, private joy that is not cruelty, but the relief of a system correcting itself. Call me a bureaucrat's romantic. I went to the meetings, to the hearings, and I watched as the people who'd built an empire of little lies began to edge toward panic. The HOA president, Janice, stopped smiling in public. She went from visionary to defensive, from confident to brittle. Her Facebook feed, once full of staged photos and inspirational captions, became the record of a woman who was being cornered by the consequences of her policies. Then came the whistles from the more dangerous direction. The developer, the one who'd sold the HOA the idea of the island transfer. He tried to wash his hands of the whole thing, defining the problem as a clerical oversight that their lawyer would happily fix. But you can't patch contempt with a checkbook forever. Documents surfaced, emails, bank transfers, notes showing promises made in private meetings. People who'd lent their names to the plat found themselves anxious and irritated in equal measure. It's funny. Greed looks coordinated until the money becomes a liability. Once it becomes a liability, greed looks like a coward. I stayed meticulous. I made sure the county's evidence was airtight. I walked county attorneys through my notes like a teacher guiding a pupil through a complicated plan. They began to call me in more often, and I started noticing the pattern that breaks many such schemes. When you threaten someone's legitimacy, their first instinct is to dig in. When that fails, they panic. When panic meets county procedure, things break in spectacularly predictable ways. One of the HOA's invoices contained a double entry. A contractor paid twice for the same stretch of pier. Another vendor revealed he had never held the environmental permits spelled out in his contract. One by one, the little lies became a chain. Chains make for easy evidence. Meanwhile, the public started to pay attention. Local blogs picked up the story. A regional paper published an investigative piece with my quote and my name. I watched the reactions like a slow sunrise. Some people were outraged. Some were skeptical. But a lot of people were simply interested. Curiosity is the first step to accountability. When strangers start paying attention, the things you thought private become public. The HOA's supporters, those who had invested emotionally and financially, started to patch their arguments. "We tried to do the right thing," they said. "We were misled." Those words would have been convincing if they hadn't been said after a ribbon-cutting ceremony with champagne and smiling faces. Actions trump words. All of this could have been resolved quietly, maybe, with an apology and a promise to redo the legal steps properly. But they were too deep in image and ego to back down gracefully. That's the thing about people who want to rule. They always believe the rules are for other people. And because they believed that, I had to organize a different kind of response. I worked with the county to build a case that's less about revenge and more about restoring what had already been taken. We laid out the paperwork for a quiet title action, a legal procedure that would force a judge to look, to compare deeds, to verify coordinates. Quiet in name, thunderous in consequence. There were threats, of course, legal notices that hinted at countersuits, angry blog posts accusing me of ruining community plans. Someone left a rock on my porch with a note that said, "Stop." I photographed the rock, mailed it to the county with a formal complaint, and put the photo in the file. Threats are a kind of currency in these fights. They spend louder than they are worth. People with something to hide tend to use noise because they think noise covers truth. It doesn't. It only marks them. The HOA responded publicly by calling me a troublemaker and privately by phoning my bank, claiming liens and risk. The insurance cancellation that landed on my kitchen table felt like the first real amount of cold air the whole thing had ever given me. For one night, I sat at the table, a coffee gone cold beside my hand, and thought about giving it all up. There were practical voices in my ear, Dana pleading, friends warning, the ledger of bills and life telling me this was a gamble. But that night I thought of the dock I'd built with Helen, of the way she'd laughed when a plank went crooked, and I felt something steady in my chest. This wasn't about money. It was about memory and dignity. I folded the certified survey into the jacket pocket and slept on the sofa with the radio turned low, listening to the lake breathe. In the background, the mechanics of law spun. We filed the quiet title. Notices went out. The HOA's lawyer, a man with a polished tie and a wallet that smelled of expensive leather, objected at first, formally, aggressively. He filed motions, demanded discovery, tried to make the process as expensive and slow as possible, hoping delay would equal defeat. He was banking on the tiredness of one man versus the resources of a group. He miscalculated. The county had already begun a parallel track. Code enforcement had slapped stop work orders on the cabins. An environmental inspector issued a notice that the septic plans submitted were incomplete and that construction in a protected watershed required a different set of state approvals. Suddenly, the cabins weren't just a civil tangle. They were a regulatory problem nobody wanted to own. When our first hearing date came, the small courthouse felt too bright for the amount of heat brewing outside. Reporters hovered like gulls. The HOA board members sat clustered in the back like a nervous choir. Their lawyer tried to frame the case as a misunderstanding, but the judge kept steering the record back to concrete facts, signed deeds, recorded surveys, federal GPS coordinates, and the absence of a state filing for the HOA's plat. Judges are fond of hard boundaries. They prefer ink to rhetoric. The more the HOA tried to sway the room with emotion, the more their arguments shrank under scratch paper and stamps. Then something unexpected happened a week before the main hearing. A small, earnest knock came at my door. It was one of Janice's board members, a man named Tom, who'd always seemed more comfortable with spreadsheets than with confrontation. He stood on my step like a man about to hand over a confession. "I can't do this anymore," he said, voice low. "We were told it was legitimate. I signed, but I didn't see. I didn't look. I don't want any part of this." He handed me an envelope with a USB drive and a stack of printouts, emails showing internal warnings, minutes from meetings where the legal irregularities were discussed and then dismissed. His hand shook. My heart did not race. The kind of relief I felt then is weird to explain. It was like finding an extra piece of rope when you'd already tied a knot. The case was stronger now, not just because of documents, but because of people who decided to tell the truth despite their earlier complicity. If the first part of this story was watching them build, the second part was watching their paper worlds unravel under methodical pressure. Not dramatic fireworks, not a mob with torches, just testimony, signatures, and a quiet parade of facts stepping forward one by one. The HOA's PR machine faltered because reality does not care for spin. It cares for deeds, and deeds are filed in state registries that do not bend for charm. We were headed toward the hearing that would decide whether the deed was honored and whether those 23 cabins would be labeled what they were: illegal encroachments on private land. I slept poorly the night before, feeling that old pre-inspection jitter that had sharpened me for half a lifetime. In the morning, I packed my notes, my veteran's cap, and the photocopy of the deed I'd had in my jacket months earlier. I locked the house and walked out to my truck, watching the lake through the birches like I had a second life to protect. I felt tired, but not alone. Dana had flown in. Earl and a few others, old colleagues and newer friends, were there. The courthouse steps felt heavier with expectation than they had any right to be. As I climbed them, I thought about how small acts make a difference. Filing a paper, saving an email, pressing record on an old camcorder. All those stupid, careful things that seemed insignificant months ago were the threads that now wove into a rope. You don't always know when threads will matter. You just keep them safe, and you trust that when you need them, they'll hold. The hearing was set. The room filled. The judge called the case. And at that moment, with the bench looking down at me and the cabin-scented memory of Helen at my shoulder, I felt something like calm. The fight had been long, but it was ordered now. The rest would be a matter of law. The rest would be a matter of truth on paper. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee, two things that never mix but somehow always exist together in places like this. Janice sat across from me, her perfectly styled hair looking less like authority and more like armor. Each HOA board filled the benches behind her, whispering nervously. They thought I'd crumble, that maybe I'd fold under the weight of paperwork or legal tricks. But I'd spent months preparing for this, and unlike them, I had truth on my side, and the original deed in my hand. When the judge entered, everyone stood. I stayed calm, one hand resting on my briefcase. Janice's lawyer started first, spinning a tale about how the HOA had lawfully acquired and developed community land for public benefit. It was polished, almost poetic, the kind of performance lawyers give when they know their client is in deep trouble but still hope to sell confidence. Then it was my turn. I stood, opened the case, and gently placed a stack of documents on the table. The courtroom projector flicked on, and I pointed at the screen. This, I said, is the original deed to the island, signed, notarized, and recorded in 2009 under my name. No transfer, no sale, no subdivision, just me. I let the words settle like dust after a storm. The judge adjusted her glasses, leaning closer. Janice's lawyer fumbled for words, asking to verify authenticity. I smiled. Already verified by the county records office this morning, I said. And if you'd like, Your Honor, we can compare signatures to the one filed 2 months ago by the HOA. That's when I played my trump card. I handed over a forensic report from a handwriting analyst, one the county sometimes used for fraud investigations. The HOA filing contains multiple forged signatures, including a fake notary seal. The individual who submitted the paperwork is currently under investigation. The room went silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner. Janice's confidence evaporated in real time. Her jaw tightened, eyes darting to the side, searching for an exit that didn't exist. The judge turned toward her. MRS. Fowler, do you have any comment on this? She stammered something about a clerical error and miscommunication. The judge raised an eyebrow. 23 cabins built on private land is not a clerical error, ma'am. The laughter that broke from the back benches wasn't polite. It was raw, sharp, the kind that carries years of frustration from people tired of HOA tyranny. I didn't laugh, though. I just waited, patient and steady, letting the silence drag Janice closer to her unraveling. My lawyer, a calm older man named Peters, took over next. He showed drone footage, images of bulldozers, chopped trees, and cabin foundations, all time-stamped after the fraudulent transfer. These actions, he said, were not only unauthorized but also in direct violation of county environmental codes. My client could press for damages exceeding $1.2 million. Janice's face went pale. Her lawyer whispered something frantically, probably asking if there was any settlement option left. There wasn't. The judge called for a recess, and that's when she approached me. She tried to smile, her voice trembling. Look, maybe we can come to some agreement. The cabins are already built. We can buy the land from you. I looked at her for a long moment. You built 23 homes on stolen property, I said. You didn't ask permission. You didn't check ownership. You just assumed you could take it. So no, Janice. You don't get to buy what you already tried to steal. Her lips quivered, and she turned away, muttering something under her breath. I didn't bother listening. Some people only learn when the consequences finally cost them everything. When the session resumed, the judge's ruling was swift and clear. The island, and everything built on it, legally reverted to me. The HOA was ordered to pay restitution for property damage and legal fees, and all construction activity was permanently halted. Janice's lawyer tried to request a stay, but the judge shut him down instantly. You may appeal, counselor, she said, but you'll be doing so without possession of the land. That was it. Years of arrogance, undone in 20 minutes. The HOA members filed out quietly, faces blank. Some angry, some defeated. Janice stayed seated for a moment longer, staring at the empty space in front of her like she couldn't believe it was over. Then she stood, heels clicking against the floor, and left without a word. I gathered my documents, thanked the judge, and walked out into the sunlight. It was warm, bright, the kind of light that feels like a clean slate. My lawyer clapped me on the shoulder. "You handled that perfectly," he said. I nodded. "They built an empire on lies," I replied. "I just let them finish before I took the ground out from under it." A week later, the cabin stood empty. No laughter, no lights, just the wind moving through hollow rooms. Eventually, the county arranged for their removal, and one by one, they came down. I kept one, cabin #1, renovated it, painted it white, turned it into a quiet guest house overlooking the lake. Sometimes when I sit on the porch at sunset, I think about how close they came to taking everything, how arrogance blinds people to the simple truth that not everything is theirs to control. And whenever I hear about another HOA throwing its weight around, I smile and whisper to myself, "Careful who you build on." Then I take a sip of coffee, watch the water ripple against the shore, and feel that deep, satisfying peace that only comes when justice finally swings back the right way. And if anyone out there's ever had an HOA push too far, remember this: silence isn't weakness, it's strategy.